The door to the hi-fi shop on Washington Boulevard in Ogden, Utah, closed just before closing time, sealing the people inside into a night they would not survive unchanged. It was Monday, April 22nd, 1974. The showroom lights were still on, stereo receivers and speakers lined up in neat rows, and the last minutes of business felt ordinary. Then several men came in with the calm of customers and the intention of predators. Dale Selby Pierre and William Andrews produced handguns and took control of the store. A third airman, Keith Roberts, remained outside as the driver. Investigators would later determine that additional men were involved in the robbery, but Pierre and Andrews were the ones who controlled the victims inside. They ordered the two young employees working that night, Stanley Walker, 20 years old, and Sherry Michelle Ansley, 18, down into the basement. They bound them, threatened them, and began stripping the store of expensive equipment. The plan wasn't a quick smash and grab. They were settling in, moving merchandise as if time didn't matter. The robbery did not stay contained. A 16-year-old named Courtney Naisbitt walked in during the holdup, looking for Stanley. Pierre and Andrews forced him downstairs too. Time dragged on. The basement became a holding pen where the victims listened to footsteps overhead and the scrape of boxes being moved, never sure if the next sound would be a door opening or a gunshot. When Stanley did not come home, his father, Orrin Walker, 43, drove to the shop to look for him. He walked into the same trap and was pushed into the basement with the others. Later, when Courtney still hadn't returned, his mother, Carol Naisbitt, 52, arrived, and she was taken as well. One by one, ordinary concern pulled more people into the room until 5 hostages were bound in the basement of an audio store. Pierre and Andrews kept the victims under constant pressure. They demanded information, searched pockets, and used violence to enforce silence. During the captivity, a sexual assault was committed against Ansley, carried out with threats and force. It was another layer of terror, meant to crush resistance and remind everyone on that basement floor that the rules were whatever the gunmen decided. The hours were not a blur to the people trapped there. They were a sequence of moments in which every breath felt conditional. Eventually, the attackers shifted from robbery to elimination. Fear of being identified turned into a decision. No one could be left alive to describe their faces, their voices, their names. Pierre and Andrews began shooting the bound victims in the basement at close range. Stanley Walker was killed. Michelle Ansley was killed. Courtney Naisbitt was shot and left with severe injuries. Orrin Walker was shot. Carol Naisbitt was shot and would later die from her wounds at the hospital. Even then, Pierre and Andrews acted as if bullets weren't enough. They produced a bottle of liquid drain cleaner, Drano, and forced the victims to drink it, apparently believing it would kill them. Instead, it burned mouths and throats and continued damaging tissue internally, turning survival into a slow emergency. The attackers believed it would finish what their gunshots had not, erasing witnesses through poison and pain. When Pierre and Andrews left the store, the basement was quiet except for suffering. Orrin Walker was still alive and able to communicate. Courtney Naisbitt was alive as well, gravely injured. Help arrived, and the scene stunned responders. A robbery that had become torture, chemical burns layered on top of gunshot wounds, and 2 survivors fighting to stay conscious. Doctors worked to keep the victims alive, but 3 people, Stanley Walker, Michelle Ansley, and Carol Naisbitt, were dead. Investigators moved quickly and methodically. The stolen merchandise could be traced by serial numbers, and the shop's inventory gave police a way to identify specific pieces of equipment once they resurfaced. Leads pointed toward Hill Air Force Base, where Pierre, Andrews, and Roberts were stationed. Detectives followed tips and watched for airmen suddenly in possession of high-end stereos. Warrants and interviews produced links back to the hi-fi shop. Investigators recovered stolen equipment that could be matched to the store by serial number, and they recovered the half-empty bottle of Drano that had been used in the basement. The property trail mattered because it turned horror into evidence, something that could be weighed and documented and presented to a jury. Investigators learned that the robbery had not been an impulsive smash and grab. Pierre and Andrews had come prepared to move large amounts of equipment, and the presence of a driver outside suggested planning. When police followed the property trail, they found paperwork that mattered. Flyers connected to the hi-fi shop, a rental contract for a storage unit, and then the equipment itself, stacked away from the base and away from casual view. In the storage unit, stereo components taken from the hi-fi shop were recovered and identified by serial numbers, and the Drano was tied back to the assault in the basement. As the case developed, it also became clear that not everyone involved was going to be completely accounted for. 3 other participants were never caught. The arrests brought the crime out of rumor and into court record. Roberts, described as the driver outside the store, was convicted of robbery for his role. Pierre and Andrews were convicted of murder and aggravated robbery. In court, the prosecution laid out the crime in strict sequence: the takeover at closing time, the growing list of hostages pulled in by worried family members, the prolonged captivity, the shootings, and the forced ingestion of drain cleaner. Jurors heard how the violence escalated step by step, each decision tightening the trap, each hour increasing the attacker's fear of identification until murder became, in their minds, the solution. The survivors' injuries did not end when the store was cleaned and the blood was gone. Orrin Walker lived with permanent physical damage from the attack, carrying the consequences long after the headlines faded. Courtney Naisbitt survived with significant long-term effects from his injuries, including brain damage and chronic pain, and he was unable to testify at trial. Survival meant years of treatment, limitations that shaped daily life, and memories tied to specific sounds and moments that could not be unlearned. For the families of the dead, grief was paired with the awful clarity of how their loved ones ended up there, not through risk, not through recklessness, but through ordinary responsibility and concern. Years later, people in Ogden still spoke about how the crime expanded, victim by victim, as family members searched for someone who was late. Orrin Walker had survived long enough to describe what he witnessed in that basement. Courtney Naisbitt survived, but suffered amnesia and brain damage from his injuries, and he could not take the stand. The case left a permanent mark on how the community thought about random violence and on how investigators studied crimes that escalate from robbery into calculated attempts to erase witnesses. The legal process outlasted the crime by decades. Dale Selby Pierre and William Andrews were sentenced to death. Pierre was executed in 1987. Andrews was executed by firing squad in 1992. The case remained notorious in Utah because it combined captivity, torture, and a calculated attempt to make survival impossible. It also became part of broader public debate over capital punishment and claims of racial bias raised around the trials and sentences. For Ogden, the hi-fi murders became a dividing line: an ordinary errand, a worried father checking on his son, a mother searching for her teenager. Each small choice led straight into the basement of that shop. The survivors lived, but not as they had lived before, and the families of the dead were left with the knowledge that the night began with a door closing at the end of business and ended with violence no one expected to find in a stereo store. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.